Hey, it's Tom from TomsToons, and in this video, we're going to give you sort of the abbreviated, but we're going to cover everything, the installation of the new railing kit from pontoonstuff.com. This is the metallic black. This is a 18-foot kit, and it's 8.5 foot wide with the stern entry sun deck. We're going to cover the hardware that comes with it, all the parts and pieces, the tools you'll need, everything in this video to make the installation smooth on your boat. If you're installing a different size kit, it's going to be relatively the same, and every boat's a little different anyway, so your measurements aren't going to be exactly what mine are in this video, but this is going to show you the steps that we take to install these railing kits. Remember, if you're shopping for this new railing kit, a new ladder for your pontoon boat, flooring kits, seating, anything you need for your pontoon restoration project, you can use our coupon code to save 5% at pontoonstuff.com. Just click down in the description below. Our coupon code is there to save you money, and it helps our channel out a little bit too.
While this video is going to be a little bit more of an abbreviated version, you can head over to our YouTube channel for a full in-depth installation of another railing kit that we have posted. With that being said, we're going to jump right into putting this sun deck kit together as part of the railing kit. We're going to start with a 16-inch panel. There's no holes on top. That's going to go on the outside of that U-shaped panel, and we're using the barrel nut and bolt to attach everything in this sun deck kit. This other 16-inch panel has a single hole in it. That is going to be on the other side of the U-shape where Corey's putting it right now, and that's where our support bar is going to attach. This single panel is going to span across the width. This would be enclosed, typically your fuel tank. And to start, we just hand tighten everything, just getting that barrel nut on the bolt. You've got a panel in the kit with the accent bars but no holes. This is going to be your door for the stern entry. Set that aside for now. And we have two smaller panels with holes drilled in the top. Those are going to be for our sun deck cushion, where that's going to install in the middle or over the motor. To attach that panel to the fuel tank enclosure, you're going to need the long bolt and nut that's going to go through 3 sections of that railing tube. We're still just hand tightening everything in at this point. We'll go through with a wrench and tighten everything fully before we put it up on the boat. This next panel is going to have 2 holes in the top, as well as a piece of the actual fence panel notched out. So that's where our support bar is going to run across and bolt into. This is where your door will close into for the stern entry as well. And we're still just using the bolts and barrel nuts to hold all of this together. With everything hand tightened, we're ready to use our tools. I use a small ratchet with a number 3 Phillips bit, and you're going to need a 5mm Allen wrench. You're also going to need a 7/16 open wrench or socket. For our bolt and barrel nut combos, if you tighten the bolt into the barrel nut is serrated and it will grab. I'm just going to go around and I'm going to line each panel up. I get it snug, I make any last adjustments, and then I tighten it fully. We're going to tighten it all the way, but not so far as to crush in the actual railing or the square tube of the railing. At the junction where 3 tubes meet, I'll use the Allen wrench and the 7/16 wrench in order to tighten that. Once everything's tight, we're ready to go ahead and move this up onto the boat so we can start mocking things up and moving forward with the other panels. With the stern entry kit roughly in place, we're going to go ahead and put in the support bar. It's going to help keep everything together. That's in the hardware provided. You're going to have 6 stainless machine screws with locking nuts and washers. The tube itself is a section of railing tube. It has that flange. We're going to face that into the boat and down. There are holes machined out on each side and we're going to install our plates across. There are 2 holes. They're going to line up with the tube. Run our bolts through. We're going to sandwich in the tube with the 2 plates and just loosely get a nut on there to hold everything in place. I'm going to do that to both sides of the tube so that we can get ready to put it up on the stern entry kit. Again, I'm going to orient that flange facing into the boat and downward. I slide that into place on the panel where the door will close, and then I can go ahead and run a bolt down through and get a nut on the bottom side. With one side attached, I can slide the other side over onto that U-shaped portion where the fuel tank will go. We'll drop a bolt in there, and we can go ahead and tighten that nut and bolt that go into the tube of the railing. The other 2 that are on the support bar, we can snug up, but we're not going to fully tighten until we get everything where we want it. We're going to try to make sure everything's square the best we can before running any bolts down into the deck of the boat. That tube for support has machined oval holes in it, so there is room for manipulating the width of that enclosure. Once I've got everything squared up and tightened down, I'll double check, make sure it's where I like it, and then we'll be ready to move on to extending the side panels to help get this mocked up. We still haven't tightened anything down to the floor yet, haven't drilled any holes or run any bolts into the deck. This next part of the process, where we're going to go ahead and run our panels down the port side, extending from the sun deck, is going to be different for every boat. This is going to depend on your layout, your actual railing kit length, and where your seats are. So there might be some changing here. We typically get some panels in place, sort of mock it up, make sure our seats are going to fit, and then we can move forward in terms of hand tightening the barrel, nut, and bolts together. It's definitely one of the neat parts about these railing kits is there are enough panels that you can manipulate where they go to meet the look you're looking for, but also your seating arrangement. As I mock things up, get them in place, I'm just going to hand tighten that machine screw and barrel nut. That way if I need to move things, I still can. We'll tighten everything shortly. With those panels extending forward from the sun deck, before I put any doors in or anything, I'm going to go ahead and mock up the front as well. In this black railing kit, you're going to have a 30-inch front corner piece, and you will have 5-inch pieces that help close the door in the front. But I need to make sure first that my seating is going to fit with those 30-inch corners and have space for the door where I had planned it out. This is going to take a few times measuring, just deciding exactly what panels to use here. With my panels chosen for the front to cover those front seats, I can go ahead and hand tighten those just like I did with the panels extending from the stern. Once I've got those front panels in, I decide the door panel I'm going to use. It's time to install a hinge so we can start getting things in place. The hinge is going to be in that hardware box. It's got 6 holes on each side of the hinge, and it's going to line up if you have this center hold hinge with the center groove of the door. That way everything lines right up on the side panel as well as the door. I start by mocking things up on the side panel, so the panel that the door is going to attach to, and I go ahead and mark holes in that side panel, and then I'm going to pilot drill them with a small drill bit. It just makes running the self-tapper provided for the hinge a lot easier and makes it easier to get it more accurate. With any lift hinge, I prefer to install them fairly high up on the panel and the door. It allows for easier opening and creates less sag on the opposite side away from the hinge. Using the stainless self-tapping screws provided, I'm going to go ahead and run that hinge into the side panel. I'm going to start the top hole. I'm not going to fully tighten, so I still have a little bit of manipulation of the hinge. Then I can run the rest of my screws in and tighten everything snug into that side panel. Once my hinge is on the side panel, I can mock up the door, keeping it flat on the deck to line up the height with the side panel. Then I mark my holes for where the hinge is going to install, pre-drill them, and then I can run my self-tappers into the door as well. Installing the hinge and door at this point, I can work on a flat surface, being just the deck, so I haven't installed any risers yet, and it's going to help me to space out the rest of my railings, because what I'm going to do here is clamp a floor spacer or a railing spacer, fence riser, in between the door at the top and the bottom. I can clamp that together, and that's going to give me the space I need for the door to open and close properly, and it's going to give me a better way of mocking up exactly where the railings are going to sit on the deck. It's basically completing my kit without permanently attaching anything. And we'll do this with every door in the kit before installing anything into the deck. That way we can move and manipulate the entire railing system together. With the port side run all the way up, I'm going to go ahead and get my starboard side coming together, extending back. In this particular layout, there is no door on the starboard side towards the middle or front like there is on the port. We're just going to have a port side door, the front door, and the starboard stern entry door. I simply bolt this panel in instead of hinging it like a door. And don't worry about the extra space created by the door on the port side. That will be made up for in the front with those 30-inch corners. As you work your way towards the stern, make sure that railing is supported by some furniture or maybe even some clamps, as it's a long span of railings without support yet. When we get to our front corners, they are going to have 5-inch spacers for this black 8.5 foot wide kit. Those are going to help close the door. If you're using one of the other kits for 8.5, the blue or the beige, you will have 36-inch corner panels. You won't have these 5-inch spacers. If you're doing an 8-foot wide kit, you'll have only the 30-inch corners without the spacers. I've been told that eventually the black kit will also be a 36-inch door without the spacers. I've got my front door installed, and I put my floor risers in to space things out. That way I can manipulate it as an entire unit and get it squared up the best I can, at least for now. And remember, nothing has been bolted to the floor yet. When I've got everything mocked up and roughly in place, I'm going to go around and I'm going to tighten with my ratchet all of my panels that bolt and barrel nut combo. To this point, they were only hand tightened, but I'm going to run that bolt into the barrel nut. Again, it's serrated, so it's going to lock my railings into place. I'm going to get the top or the bottom tightened, manipulate the railing, make sure I'm level on the top as well as on the face of the panels. And when it's where I like it, I can go ahead and tighten everything in place. I now work my way around the entire boat, tightening with my wrench. And remember, we're going to get them really nice and snug, but as soon as I start to see any of that aluminum tube collapsing, I'm going to stop. I want to avoid denting in the railings as much as possible. Once all of my railings are tightened together, I can go ahead and take a look at the back. This is a brand new 90 horsepower Mercury. It's a tall motor. I want to make sure it's not going to hit my sun deck if I can help it. That cushion will lift forward, so it wouldn't be the end of the world, but I'm going to go ahead. I've got space. I'm going to make it so the motor won't hit. To this point, I've got everything bolted together. My doors are clamped shut. The last thing I'm going to do before I start running any bolts through the floor is installing my stern entry hinge and door. It's going to open inward, so I'm going to mark on my starboard rear panel where I want to pre-drill my holes, pilot those holes out, and then we can install the hinge just like we did on the side and front door. With the hinge on the side panel, I can line my door up so the height is even, and I can mark and pre-drill my holes for the hinge on the door. With my hinge in place, I can close my door, and I'm going to use one of those door stops as my spacer for that stern entry door. I can attach it to the bottom and then close the door to make sure I have a gap between the door and the stern entry kit. With the stern entry door installed, that space accounted for, it's time to move around the boat, and I'm basically going to measure 1,000 times to make sure that I get everything squared up, front to back, side to side. I can manipulate the entire railing structure at this point because nothing's bolted down still. It's very likely that you're going to have to install your deck trim before bolting your railings down. I did have to do that in this case. I measure a few more times before I'm ready to secure anything, and then when that time comes, there is our fence bolt kit. These are 3.5-inch bolts with a washer and locking nut. I use a piece of plastic, actually, that I got from the furniture from Pontoon Stuff, and then I have a 1/4-inch drill bit and a 7/32 inch drill bit. We'll talk about that in a second. And I've got an impact driver with a number 3 Phillips head bit. You'll also likely need some clamps, and a 90-degree drill bit is going to make this a lot easier. With my railings mocked up and I'm happy with the space on the front of the boat, in this case we're not going to have a big front deck, I'm going to go through a series of just measuring, manipulating the railings, getting everything square on that rear port side where the gas tank is going to go. When I like where it's at, I can clamp it, double check my measurements over and over, and then we'll be ready to drill. I'm not going to talk specific measurements here because every boat is different. Width-wise, on an 8.5-foot kit, and even the 8-foot kit, you'll likely have somewhere around 1 inch to 1.25 inches of space between the railing and the edge of the deck trim. When I get everything square, I'm going to use that plastic, or you could use cardboard to protect the railing panels as I run my drill bit down through. A trick that I've learned over time is using that 7/32 drill bit to run my hole so that when I run my 1/4-inch deck bolt through, it will thread into the wood. This is going to help secure everything, and it also works well in spots where you're not sure if you can get a nut on the bottom. It also works if you're running through a cross member, as you can thread that 1/4-inch bolt into the cross member for a nice secure fit. I start with each side of that fuel tank enclosure to make sure everything is square. I'm going to run my holes and my bolts through those. That way, as I move to the side and forward, I know that we're square in that back port corner. Another option, if you're not going to be able to run a nut and washer on the bottom, is to use a large stainless screw to run in place of the deck bolt. We see this all the time on factory boats, especially in the stern area where it's hard to get access sometimes. With that port side secured, I'm going to manipulate my stern entry side to get the right distance from the back deck trim. It's just a lot of measuring, adjusting, and in this case I'm able to clamp a 2x4 in place so that I can pull that stern entry panel towards the 2x4 to get it the right distance from the deck trim. I go ahead and secure the rest of the sundeck enclosure by the fuel tank, and then I can move across the back of the boat before going forward. This is just a lot of measuring, squaring things up, making sure that I'm square to my deck trim. We could use a right angle tool here as well. We're just making sure that we are as square as possible so our doors close properly and everything functions on the railing kit as it should. This is crucial too for when you install the sundeck pad to make sure that everything fits up nice and aesthetically is how you want it. I'm measuring multiple times, getting that stern entry panel where the door is going to close to squared up. Then I can run my bolts in once I get it where I want it. The 2x4 I clamped in place helps keep the distance from the deck trim correct while I manipulate the rest of the panel. My entire sundeck kit is run in. Nothing is fully tightened, but I just make sure my door can close, get that spacing right. Then I'm ready to start moving forward. I'm going to start with the port side here. I'm just going to continue measuring, making sure I have the same spacing from the railing to the edge of the deck trim as I move forward. This is a repetitive process of measuring, drilling, running a bolt down to hold everything in place, and repeating that process over and over. we're just going to make sure our railing stays square to the edge of the deck trim the whole length of the boat. When you get to the middle of your style panel, that's where this 90-degree tool is going to come in handy. I can run that right down, again protecting the railing with that plastic or cardboard. I can drill my hole through the deck. You may be going through your deck trim too, depending on the style of the deck trim. That's completely fine. The railings will actually help secure the deck trim to the deck. I just continue moving forward now, keeping my spacing right, and drilling my holes as I go. I work my way all the way to that port side door. This is where having that clamp with the fence risers in is critical. That way I can manipulate, get the same spacing on the front part of the railing kit, and my door will still open and close properly. We have to have that space there, otherwise your door is going to pinch. I keep working my way forward, following the same spacing. I'm going to go all the way to the front of my straight panels, but I'm not going to put any holes in my front corner, that 30-inch corner panel yet. That's critical. We want to get both sides of our straight panels in before we start to work on the front of the boat. That way we can manipulate the front and make sure that it's going to be where we want it. Everything's square here. We're going to move to the port side and get those secured. I'm measuring here to get the same distance back for my front sections of railing so that we're squared up in the front. This accounts for that door on the port side and make sure that my panels going forward are the same for the front section. I use a little piece of painter's tape to mark on my deck trim where those panels should come together. And now I can manipulate the spacing, get that where I want it on my starboard side, and I can drill my holes and start working my way on the straight panels here as well. Just like on the port side, I'm going to run all of my straight panels, but I'm not going to install anything into the front corners yet. Work my way all the way to the back, and then we'll come back to the front. Your front panels and door are going to be probably the most tedious part of this process. We're going to make sure that our door is clamped with the spacers in it, and then we're going to take a look several times, make sure that everything's squared up. And by having the spacers clamped in the front door, we can move the whole front of the railing kit to keep everything where it needs to be. I'm going to do a lot of measuring here. I emphasize on the measurements of the front of the corners and those 5-inch panels being the same from the deck trim in front. I am going to measure side to side as well, but I want to make sure that I'm square to the front as my emphasis, even over that width. If I'm off on the width by a 1/4 inch, it's never going to show, but if I'm off on the front spacing, it's more likely to show as being a little bit crooked as the door goes across the front. When I'm satisfied with my measurements and how everything's squared up, I'm going to drill the front holes of those 30-inch panels. Again, if you're installing this on a beige or blue kit, you'd be doing the same thing, but it would be one continuous 36-inch panel. I run my bolts down to make sure I hold those front corners in place, and then I can move around the rest of the front corner panels, drilling my holes and running bolts through. I'll also run a bolt through the 5-inch panels too. One last check, making sure everything's where I like it and square. I can manipulate those 5-inch panels just a little bit to make sure everything is squared up and the door closes nicely. One last look from the side, and we're good and square. We're ready to install our washers and nuts. I've already run my bolts down through. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to hand tighten, and not even fully. I'm going to leave some space on that bolt because I need to still lift the whole railing to put a fence riser underneath. So I just get them started all the way around the boat, just threading it on a few spins, but again leaving some space, about a 1/4 inch, for the fence riser to fit underneath. And I'm going to go up in the stern entry or sundeck kit area and make sure I have my bolts run there too, the ones that are going to be behind the furniture. If I had any holes that I drilled that were 7/32 inch, I'm going to make sure I back out all of my bolts just enough, again, for that fence riser to fit underneath. These are a critical part, especially with having vinyl floors, but even with carpet, they allow airflow and water to move underneath the railings and seats to help keep your floor dry. When installing the fence risers, I like to put a piece of cardboard on top of the deck trim, and then I'm going to use a pry bar, and I'm going to lift the railing. If you have a second set of hands, it's very helpful here too. But I manipulate, lift the railing, and slide my fence riser under just to meet up so it's flush with the outside of the railing. I'm going to repeat this process all the way down the boat on both sides, as well as the stern entry kit or the sun deck kit. We're going to lift the entire railing system up. It's important to note that on that front door, you may have to shim or shave your fence risers to get the door to close nice and even across the top. It's very helpful to unclamp those doors at this point so that you can lift the railing easier. Once I've got those in place, I'm going to use a 7/16 either ratchet with a socket or an end wrench, and then I'm using my small ratchet with a Phillips number 3 head bit to get everything tightened in place. Once my railings are all tightened all the way around, it's time for our railing supports. These are going to go on each side of each door and a lot of times in the back near the stern entry on the starboard side to secure everything and to help strengthen the railing kit as a whole. The railing supports also give you the chance to manipulate your doors to close more squarely. If installing those railing supports as they came in the kit, you'll drill a hole through the railing, run your bolt and nut through, and then you can secure it to the floor once you've made sure the railings are where you want them. Again, manipulating the door to close properly is something you can do here. I'm going to make sure my spacing on both sides is the same. My door is nice and square. I can even measure to make sure that my railing supports meet up even on the floor. And I repeat the process on the other side. I could use a 7/32 drill bit here to run into the floor as well as into the rail with a shorter bolt so there is no nut showing. That's something that I commonly do. With my gate stop in place to hold the bottom of the door together, I'm going to do one more time manipulating the front railing to make sure I like how the door closes. Then I can run my last bolt in to get those railings supported and make sure everything's square. You'll repeat the same process at each door and typically on that starboard panel towards the stern entry to help reinforce that railing too. Once those railing supports and gate stops are in, the railings are essentially installed into the deck. It's time to move on to the sun deck pad. The hardware provided includes an 1 3/4 stainless bolt, washer, and wing nuts currently. We're going to swap out those wing nuts for a locking or nylock nut. This is also stainless steel. The kits will likely be updated soon to have this type of nut. For this, I'm going to need a number 3 Phillips head screwdriver bit as well as an open end wrench, 7/16. I've got my hardware and my cushion. There is a flap of vinyl that's going to help cover the hinge. I'm going to make sure that my curve is on the outside. The hinge is on the back of the stern entry kit or sun deck kit. Before I install this, I'm going to run my hardware through both the hinge as well as the vinyl. I do this upside down, and then I'll close the hinge, which will orient the bolts in the right direction. Holding that hinge shut, I'm going to put the sun deck on, oriented correctly, and I'm going to guide those bolts down through the holes that are already drilled in that stern entry or sun deck kit. With the bolts lined up and dropped into the top of the railing, I can keep pressure on the back of the sun deck pad, and I can open it so I can manipulate those bolts from the top to get them to drop all the way through the railing. This will give me access on the bottom side to run a washer and nut. With all of the bolts in place, I'm going to really carefully close that hinge, make sure my bolts are still sticking through, and then I can get that washer and nut on. That way nothing can pull out and the cushion will be held in place until I tighten it. I get all of my nuts and washers on, just hand tighten the best I can. Then I can open things up, and from the top, I'm going to get things tightened up. I'm not going to tighten anything completely here. I'm just going to get them started because once I get my middle cushion on, I still want to be able to manipulate my cushions to close everything up nice and tight and not have any gaps in those cushions. I repeat the same process on that middle sundeck cushion. This is the bigger cushion, so more bolts, a little bit more to line up here. Helps definitely to have a second set of hands, but it is possible to do it yourself as well. We'll get all of our bolts run through the hinge and the vinyl, and then we'll be ready to run them down through the railing, manipulate them, and get nuts and washers on the bottom side. A critical point here is do not install your rear seating until you get this cushion in. You're going to need that space to open the cushion fully, and it just helps to have room to work in there to get those bolts to drop in properly. It helps to get a couple of those bolts to drop all the way through, and then as soon as you can, get a nut and washer on them to prevent the other bolts or cushion from lifting out. Once I've got all of my hardware in and hand tightened, I can close the sundeck up and make sure it's square on my railings and see if I need to manipulate it side to side. Those hinges are grooved in with an oval. They're machined out to be able to manipulate side to side. When I decide where I want that, I can squeeze it inward to the outer cushion or put it wherever it needs to be. Then I will fully tighten that cushion. With the middle cushion fully installed and tightened, you are likely going to have a gap between it and that port side outer cushion. So I'm going to manipulate that cushion towards the middle cushion, get everything tightened so that when I close it, we don't have that gap. Now I can move my rear seating into place and get that installed. On this 8.5-foot kit, there is space for an armrest or a longer bench, but it's nice to have that space sometimes too for walking through. With that sundeck pad installed, we're ready to put the finishing touches on, which are our gate stops. We're going to line them up with the panel so the door can close in, and then we'll run the stainless screw provided down through to lock everything in place. This style of gate stop allows us to lift on that lift hinge, slide the door in place, and then drop it to close. If your door is hitting on the gate stop, even in the lifted position, you may have to carefully trim down that door stop to allow for the door to lift over the inside portion. If reusing a permanent mount tank, you can get new aftermarket fittings for fill and vent, and this enclosure fits pretty good size standard fuel tanks. There's also space underneath that sundeck pad for your battery or battery systems. That is a wrap on this 8.5-foot stern entry kit. Remember, every boat's a little different, but hopefully this is a good guide to get you started on your install. Thank you for watching.